horrible places to live. But also what was interesting, he also invited 2 young Tibetan nuns who, you know, as you know, Tibetans the last 50, 60 years have been, you know, under the hands of the Chinese communists, so it's pretty intense, and they were in prison for a couple of years, and they'd been tortured and sexually abused in prison for being Buddhist, right? That's the trouble. So anyway, the point is they were telling their story, these young women, and they were very, very quiet, and they were in tears because the suffering was pretty intense. So what was interesting was at the end, one of them then said, and this is the approach for a Buddhist who's trying to be a Buddhist, who's using the view of karma as your explanation for why things happen. She said at the end, you know, they'd tortured, harmed, suffered, you know, brutalised, sexually abused in prison. And this is intense. At the end, one of them said, you know, there were tears, sad, and one of them said, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers, because we knew we must have harmed them in the past and because they would suffer in the future for what they did to us. So that's the response of a person who's got the view of karma, which is not instinctive. I mean, we'd rather, you understand, it's not the view we tend to have. But I remember even, I mean, in Miami, I gave a talk to, 20 years ago, there was a group, the topic was, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, there was me, a rabbi, a Lutheran, and a Catholic.
Sounds like a joke.
I know, it does, doesn't it? And the fact is, it was very interesting. I have to admit, I couldn't understand the Catholic and the Lutheran's answers to why suffering happens to, why bad things happen to good people, but never mind. But I gave my answer pretty straight, gave a talk about karma, you know. And then the rabbi clapped. And he was cracking jokes about Hitler. I don't think I've heard Jews too often crack jokes about Hitler. But he was cracking jokes about Hitler. And he was an Israeli. And he said that's the Kabbalah Jewish view. He said, we even have a saying. I remember he quoted this. He said, we have a saying, every time something bad happens, you go, great, one less debt to repay. So I mean, I think the Jews in the audience were probably gobsmacked. Regular Jews don't know about this. I remember the Dalai Lama had talks with a bunch of the rabbis. He likes to talk to the different religions. And I remember at some point he said, I wish you people would make your teachings more open. And I think he meant, you know, beyond 40-year-old males, because only 40-year-old males who do the Kabbalah. I mean, now with Madonna, everything's changed. But you understand, but that's the view in the Jewish teachings. And I remember in Dharamsala, where regularly, you know, 50% of the courses there in our centre are from Israel. I find it so fascinating. I think Israel is going to be a Buddhist country in another generation. It's really funny. Hopefully. It's amazing the number of people who are becoming Buddhists in Israel. I can never get over. I'm speechless. The last course I did, there was like 60% of the 80 people were from Israel. And it's been like that for 20 years in Dharamsala. Anyway, the point is, one of the guys there who's an observant Jew, he's a student doctor, and I'm going to be in Israel in January, and he's invited me to give a talk at his hospital. And he said he looked into it further, and he said it's even in the regular teachings. It's in the text somewhere about reincarnation and things. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's interesting. You've got to say it's interesting. So his response, you know, great, one less debt to repay. So the point is, if you haven't pulled out the weed and it bloody ripens, you know, your mean old husband or the people kill you, if you're really living sincerely according to your view, then that would be your response. And that's those young Tibetan nuns. But I mean, and see, this gets us to the point, I really like to stress this one, that everything in our mind, okay, like I keep saying to several times, I've said to Neil, we have all these assumptions. So, you know, the assumption, he was perfect in what he said. He said, the assumption is, well, when, you know, you can't change. The assumption is it's natural when you feel guilty, you know. Our assumption is, of course you can't prove karma. Our assumption is, of course you can't remember a past life. Because we have a whole series of viewpoints in our mind now that believe in the opposite. I mean, we don't think we believe in anything, but Buddha says we believe our mind is our brain. He disagrees with it. He says it's a belief. That's a shock to us because we think it's true and scientific. So what I'm getting at is, this is the Buddhist approach, the more we realise that what goes on in here, in our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our unconscious instinct, all this, it's a series of thoughts at ever subtle levels. And so the more we're familiar with whatever thoughts they are, the more we assume that's just true. We don't analyse it, we don't question it. So the Buddha's point is, whatever goes on in here determines how you experience life. So, you know, there's that rabbi who said those words. That didn't come out of the sky. but out of a philosophical view that he is living according to. Now, I remember a couple of a few years ago, one of those Malaysian airlines went down into the ocean, and all these people drowned. And then one of the couples, they're from Malaysia, they're mostly, Muslims, and the mummy and daddy were asked how they felt about the death of their daughter. Well, they said, "We are peaceful. She belongs to God, and now he's taken her back." Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but their response of being peaceful and calm was based on their viewpoints. So that in other words, what goes on in our mind determines how you feel. It's sort of obvious. They were feeling peaceful because they were living according to their philosophical view. Well, the Buddha's saying we're all full of philosophical views. But materialists say, "Oh, I don't believe in anything." But their minds are riddled with viewpoints. The viewpoint of a materialist, and I'm meaning materialist in a simple sense of a person who says their mind is their brain and their mother made them, who doesn't posit a thing called a soul or conscious, or Buddha's view of consciousness, okay? Regular people in our culture. They say literally, maybe one of you guys is the same, "Oh, I don't have a religion, I don't believe in anything." Well, Buddha says your mind is riddled with beliefs. You believe your mother actually gave you anger. You believe the Catholic nuns are the cause of your suffering. You believe your mind is your brain. You believe you started in your mother's womb. So really what I'm saying is, everybody around the world has all these different viewpoints. We give some of them labels. Some Australian Aboriginals have such complex viewpoints. I can't even explain how they think. Their view is so utterly different. So therefore, according to what's in your mind is how you respond. It's sort of, in a sense, not rocket science. But this is why the tragedy is we don't analyse what's going on in our mind. We don't question our assumptions. And then we assume that what we feel is true. Again, Neil's point's the perfect point. Oh, but it's natural. We'd say it's natural that if you're around mean people, you feel bad. It's natural when you do something wrong, you feel guilty. No, it's not natural, in the sense that it is natural, but it's based on a series of assumptions in our mind. And that's because the Buddha's view, because the Buddha stresses so much the importance of the mind, then clearly you have to start looking at what you think. And naturally, as you keep looking, you go deeper and deeper and deeper at ever more subtle assumptions. Are we communicating here? Yeah. It's just that we don't tend to do this emotionally. I mean, if you're studying maths, if you're studying music, you keep going ever more deeply into the meaning of these things. You get really subtle understanding of music and of maths. You're using your mind, Everything's based on what's in the mind. It's sort of obvious in a sense. So clearly from the Buddhist perspective, all your happiness comes from all your viewpoints in your mind, all your assumptions, and all your suffering comes from the same. So he says we can change it. So therefore we have to assume what he's saying. Not assume, it's true what he's saying. In this I didn't finish all that. Let's start looking at more depth in the mind now, the contents of our mind. Like I said, there are three categories. According to Buddhist psychology, there are three categories of states of mind. There are millions of states of mind. Millions of them. But there are three categories into which they all fall. Those that are neurotic, delusional, distorted, disturbing, which are the voices of ego, I like to call them that, which we consider normal, therefore don't ever question. And like we talked already, anger, fears, jealousy, depression, you name it, these ordinary words. Then there are those that are positive, or virtuous, or wholesome, or useful, or beneficial, and they're the source of our happiness. Kindness, love, compassion, these ordinary words. The third category, these are called neutral insofar as they're neither virtuous in their category nor non-virtuous, meaning they're like concentration, good memory. Everybody needs those. One of them is called mindfulness, which is like good memory. It's not a holy thing. Mindfulness just means not forgetting what you're doing from moment to moment. Well, as Lama Zopa says, thieves need mindfulness. It's just the capacity to not forget what you're doing. And if you're really going to go deep into your mind and unpack and unravel its contents, you need really good focus, you need really good concentration, you need really good attention, you need really good mindfulness. These are all different states of mind. And these are cultivated to an incredible degree of subtlety in this concentration technique that these Indians invented 3,000 years ago. So there are these three categories. Those that are neurotic and delusional and make you crazy and cause you to harm others. Those that are virtuous and reasonable and positive and effective. And this is where he makes this massive distinction. And this is why the conclusion from the Buddha's point of view, having done the job in his own mind, he's rid the mind of all the rubbish because he says they're misconceptions and therefore you can remove them, which seems a bit abstract to us because we just think as Neil's saying they're natural, that has happened spontaneously, you know. And then the positive ones, to grow those to this limitless degree. Are we communicating with this concept? So therefore you've got to know your mind. It's obvious. If the mind is the main source of your happiness, and the mind is your main source of your suffering, and you want happiness and don't want suffering, it's a no-brainer. You better learn about your mind, baby. And learn these techniques to help you go in deep. And don't think it's cosmic. It is not cosmic. It's intense and focused and rigorous and disciplined. This is why we've got such an addiction in our culture about spiritual teachings being kind of cosmic and mystical and beyond comprehension, that we make this fantasy nonsense about what meditation is, you know. I mean, everyone's allowed to use that word and define it as they wish. I'm using the Buddha's approach here. So it sounds easy enough, like if you know, again, the simple analogy, the weeds are all the rubbish and the flowers are all the goodness. I know it's simplistic, but it's a good analogy. If the job is to identify all the weeds and pull them out, and to grow the flowers and develop them, that sounds pretty clear. But obviously, again, using the analogy, if that's the job out there, you know, you can look at the garden until the cows come home. This is where a misconception about being mindful as meditation. People think by being mindful you can do this job. But being mindful means being focused, not losing your memory, not wandering off in your own head, training your mind to be very focused so you don't forget what you're doing. You're training it to be really harnessed, really focused, really clear. So you could have really good mindfulness. You could be looking at that garden out there and, you know, and being very mindful of it, even so well that you can even, you know, replicate it in a drawing. That's possible. But what good is that? Because if you, once on the basis of being mindful of what's in your garden, by looking and paying attention, on the basis of seeing what's in the garden, how can you learn to do something about it if you don't know, if you don't understand botany? The point I'm making is this: you've got your garden full of weeds and herbs and flowers and vegetables, right? But you don't know botany. So no matter how much you remember what's there, how well you can draw the cauliflowers and the roses and identify them all visually without knowing their names, what good is that? So what is the point of being mindful but not knowing really deeply how to identify all the millions of states of mind that are all mixed together, quite tricky, you know? We only know we're angry when it's really violent. We only know we're depressed when you can't get out of bed one morning. But to go deep into your mind and to understand the conceptual stories at a much subtler level that are really much more nuanced and more subtle and more mixed together, it's very hard to do this. So we have to learn, you know, we're choosing. If we choose to, say, be a Buddhist, you're choosing Buddha's assessment of the mind, which is like Buddhist botany, if you like. You've got to have a way to understand the contents of your mind. And that's the difficult part. Because, you know, right now, the love and the attachment, for example, these two, attachment's under the negative heading and love is under the positive heading. But the trouble is they don't come in, you know, you don't have your weeds in that end of the garden and your flowers in the other. Then it's easy to pull the weeds out, isn't it? But they're all mixed together. They're mixed together so we can't differentiate between them. And that's the tricky part. So if I say, I love Neil, love is a positive state of mind. It's altruistic. It's necessarily virtuous. It's beneficial. It's useful. It brings me joy and happiness, and it causes me to want to help Neil. It's perfect. We all want more of that in the world. But why is it difficult to grow it? Because it's polluted at the moment with my attachment, which is necessarily I-based. And this attachment, you know, at a gross level, if you're a junkie falling on the floor overdosing on heroin or alcohol, it's easy to get attachment. It's an extreme level of it. But attachment's way more subtle, way more nuanced, deeper, deeper down, you know. Harder to recognize as you get more deeply into your mind. And this is the trouble, it's the pollution. It makes a mess of the love. So if I say I'm in love with Neil, we know it's this blissful feeling, Neil looks completely divine, finally I've found happiness, we're going to be together till we're 80-something, whatever. That's 99% attachment talking. And so naturally, okay, love is defined as, may Neil be happy. It's a wish that someone be happy. If someone is happy, you delight in their happiness. That's what they call love. And of course you grow that. You have to grow that for your sake and the sake of others. Compassion is empathy with someone suffering. That's another positive state of mind, pretty obvious. We have both of those. We have them, you know. But the trouble is we don't notice the attachment. We don't notice this intense I-based, ego-based, fear-based, neurotic craving and neediness in there. It's really hard to recognize it when, especially, the love is there and everything's so lovely and wonderful. So the millisecond, so as long as we're together, let's say, me and Neil basically is kind and loving and thoughtful and generous and does what I want every moment, which in other words, he satisfies my attachment, then of course it's easy to love him. It's easy to want him to be happy. But then we move in together and then the problems start. You know, he farts in the sheets instead of the toilet. He leaves the toilet seat up. I hear that men always leave toilet seats up and women makes them crazy. I've heard that. Is that right, ladies? Yes. That's so funny.
Leave them down, pisses them off.
That's right, there you go. So the thing is, when we're in love and there's a distance between us and I get dressed up in my best clothing and smell best when we see each other and it's all gorgeous, and you get my point. Attachment's gone nuts, right? Attachment is over-exaggerated neediness for somebody, and there's Neil, and I completely believe he's going to be the cause of all my happiness. The story's gone mad in our minds. We can't even recognize it all. He's just gone completely berserk. And of course I love him. Of course I want him to be happy. I'll give my life for him. But as long as he does what my attachment wants. But that's the trouble. As soon as we get closer and closer, we move in together, and then as the troubles start. Because we're human, and that means because we have attachment. So the millisecond my attachment doesn't get what it wants, that means he mightn't look at me perfectly. He mightn't answer me when I say something. He might, you know, not do the dishes nicely. He might come home late. And then attachment goes berserk. Because it can't cope with anything that isn't perfect. And that's when aversion comes, and the jealousy comes, and the pain comes, and the hurt comes. But the trouble is with this, we don't know its attachment's the problem until it doesn't get what it wants. So the only way to, again, what attachment is, like I said before, it's really hard to see it until it's extreme. And we only think in our culture you've got a problem with it when you're a junkie. So basically junkie, addict, they're extreme words for what Buddha would call simply attachment, a craving for something. But we have it at subtler levels, you know. That's all. So the Buddha's view is much more nuanced than our view. So we only think you've got a problem with attachment when it's really serious, like alcohol or drugs, or you know, you're jumping on girls every day and you can't get enough. That's when it's extreme. But that never being satisfied is the energy of attachment. Then it hankers after something, and then it gloms onto something on the outside. Then it makes the thing look more delicious. Then it believes that when I get it, I'll get happy. And then it has a panic attack when you don't get it. So it's really hard to see what the Buddha is saying is the suffering of this attachment, because it seems to us just like normal human behavior. So attachment is neediness, is dissatisfaction, it's the sense that I'm not enough, it's the sense of always wanting something more. And then when it doesn't get what it wants, anger is the response. So that'll what happen when he and I get close. Suddenly I'll get upset, I'll get angry, I'll get irritated, I'll get annoyed. They're all polite words for anger. They're all polite words for the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So as long as he keeps fulfilling my needs and being kind and loving to me, you know, then I won't get upset because he's satisfying my needs. But as soon as he stops doing that, even mildly, then I freak out, anger comes. And that's when the problems start. So we don't notice there's attachment until it doesn't get what it wants. That's what's so tricky. I always use a simple example. We both like chocolate cake. We go out for chocolate cake. Oh, we like chocolate cake. But look what happens when carrot cake comes. So his view might be, oh, that's cool, I can handle carrot cake. And mine will be, hey, I ordered chocolate cake, get upset. So being upset, this is where it's so shocking too. The ordinary things like upset, annoyed, irritated, they're all polite words for anger. So when we understand this one, the Buddha is saying is that constant, deep in our bones, at this subtler level, and it can be in a gross level as well, there's this constant neediness, constant dissatisfaction, constant wanting something more, constant wanting, all the time a kind of an emotional hunger, you know, an emotional hunger really is what attachment is. And it can be subtle, it can be gross, depending on the person. They're always looking for something. And the obvious level is the objects of the senses. There's a much subtler level of it as well, we'll talk about. So then as long as it gets what it wants, and it's also instinctive, your mummy didn't teach you this, you get born with it. So, you know, as long as you didn't get, when it doesn't get what it wants, that's when instantaneously this aversion arises. There's these two fundamental states of mind, attachment and aversion. So attachment's kind of, oh yeah, that's lovely, and you go towards it. Aversion is, oh, that's disgusting, and you go away from it. And there's 1,000 times a day. But attachment's the default mode, always wanting more, always wanting something, assuming utterly, without question, that when I get it, that'll trigger some happy feelings. So there's going to be the person, the cake, the nice sound, the smell, the thing, the new bag, the new job, the new boyfriend. These are the obvious levels of it, and we don't question, I think, in our psychological models this. We would just say it's natural, meaning you'd be unnatural if you didn't have it. But Buddha, because of his own inner work, happens to point it out. That as you go deeper, you recognize this, and it's the actual pain of dissatisfaction. So therefore, it's always causing us to manipulate to get the nice things, to get Neil to do what I want, to get the weather to be good, to get the food to be good. It is natural, but when it's driven by attachment, it's kind of difficult because the tiniest thing can go wrong, you have a mental breakdown. We know this. We know this, like Neil said, it's natural. But the Buddha says we can become deeply familiar with this stuff and train our minds to change it. And not for some holy reason. This is for your own sake.
How do you train the mind?
This is what we're talking about.
To not react.
This is what we're discussing. That's all. Every word I'm saying in this room.
Yeah, but it goes to a certain point. You recognize it, and you've isolated.
This is why you need
But then what?
You need This is why you have to have concentration. Which is why I talked about this meditation technique that these Indians invented. Practicing even 3 minutes a day, focusing your mind. With not following the thoughts. We'll do some. I'll give an example of how to do it. Then what you're learning to do is see your thoughts more clearly, and then slowly, slowly, if you're using the Buddhist model, you'll recognise the attachment, the irritation, the anger, the hurt, and we're talking real subtle levels here. In advanced practice we're talking, but this is the start of the process. So the logical thing is if you're using Buddhist model to describe to yourself in your own mind, that's attachment, that's aversion, that's jealousy, blah, 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 then obviously once you understand what the thought arises in the mind, what it is, and this is already pretty subtle, then you try not to follow it. So if you're driving the car, you know the rules of driving a car, and one of the rules is you don't wander off into the wrong lane at 120 kilometres an hour. So you've got to be very noticing what's going on, isn't it? The second you catch yourself, the second you recognise what's going on, and you say, then what? Well, then what? You'd instantly apply an antidote, which is get back in the right lane. So when it's the mind, and I'm about to shout at Panos, because I'm annoyed because he didn't do what I wanted, then you catch it. You catch it and don't follow it. That's the real ideal of practice. You know your mind ever more intimately, ever more clearly, and this is a long, ongoing job, ever more subtle. Then at least when you recognise it, the first level of practice is at least don't speak it out. So the very first level of practice is basically control your body and control your speech. So the reason Buddha would even first level, remember we just began talking about what the basic level of morality, behaviour, the first level, entry level, junior school is behaviour. Don't worry about your mind yet. So given that my killing, stealing and jumping on the wrong partner and lying, simple a few actions of body and speech, given that they're driven by these delusions, right? They're driven by the neuroses. You don't kill out of love. You don't lie out of, generosity. Do you understand? All the neurotic behaviour, once we recognise that they're just the servants of what goes on in the mind, the very first level of practice is control your body and speech. And then you have the luxury of now becoming your own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, observing all the thoughts that motivate your body and speech. So that's the next real level of practice, where you now start to know your mind well, based on getting some decent concentration in meditation, based on understanding Buddha's explanation of these thoughts. The job day to day is learning to recognise them before they explode out of control. It's an intense job, full on, but it's just, that's the theory of it. That's the theory of it. Does it make sense, theoretically?
It's when you can practice non-reaction and not let them affect you, but then they sneak back.
Oh, massively, hugely, to a degree here. If we're talking about in the Buddhist view, the perspective is to get rid of them all completely. Don't hold your breath. He would say it will take many, many lifetimes, because it's that subtle, the level to which we can go, But even the general principle we can see. So not to have a misconception because you did it once, you got rid of it all. No way. It goes real deep. But that's the principle. And it's not complicated. It's just hard work. And you have to want to do it, because when you're angry and upset with somebody, everything in you is just driving you to say those words. It's really hard to really follow the thoughts and not vomit everything out. I mean, it's intensely difficult, especially when we've got very strong habits. Isn't it? I mean, intense. But that's the theory of it. That's the idea. And of course, this is why, again, Neil's point was a good one. When it's something like you're suddenly overwhelmed by this chaos in a room with a bunch of people fighting and yelling, let's say, it seems almost impossible to imagine that you could keep your mind steady in the face of that. It seems almost impossible to us. So then but that's the more we do know our mind, the more practice we do, then of course it's possible. And that means even to the point where you're about to have a crash on the freeway, of course you can keep your mind steady. Of course you can keep your mind stable, but that takes immense practice. I mean, to that degree we can do it, you know. But slowly, slowly. Don't hold our breath. Are we communicating, people? So, okay, so the thing to remember again is this is not punitive or moralistic. The reason behind, Buddhist practice is first for your own sake. First to realise that when we start to understand that my chaos and my attachment and my fears and my depression and my jealousy are what caused me pain. Yes, people do terrible things to each other. And this is where it gets a bit of a minefield, because then, then we can imagine, oh, you mean, you sort of, if you're in you see terrible suffering on this earth, people abusing each other and harming each other. And then you go, oh, well, you mean they're suffering because of their own past karma and they're suffering because of their own anger. Well, why should I help them? It's not like that at all. I mean, it's not like that. Karma and the mind are Buddha's explanation of why things happen. Christians have a different view. Communists have a different view. Everybody has a different view. So this is the view a Buddhist would take, which is why that response of those young women, Or even I remember a friend of mine in Tibet, Jigdrol, years ago. In '87, there was the first kind of mini uprising against the Chinese communists by all the Tibetans. The first one was in 1950 and then 59, right? So then, no, 1959. So what happened was, he told me, he was about 17 at the time, and he started to demonstrate. All the young monks and nuns were the main, they were the kind of the radicals. They were the ones doing all the demonstrating. So when you think of demonstration, you think of anger, people with placards shouting and yelling. So it sort of seems natural, you demonstrate because you're angry. So I remember asking, he'd escaped to Nepal, and he told me about this suffering. He'd been in these demonstrations, he'd got arrested, he got tortured, then he got released again, then he demonstrated again, then his friend had his head blown off, and then he thought by this point he better escape, so he escaped to Nepal. And then he was telling me about this, and it was, since he had escaped, his father got murdered, brother got murdered, lots of suffering. I mean, it's pretty intense what's happening in Nepal, in India, in Tibet, sorry. So then naturally I said to him, this is like 30 years ago, I said, oh, Jigdrol, do you ever get angry? And his answer is literally like this. He said, he just laughed at me casually. He said, Robina, what for? He said, it's our own fault. Now that's a shocking answer. But your rabbi would have said, that rabbi would have said the same thing. Because he had the view, in other words, this Buddhist, and this is the thing you've got to remember, in Asia, in India and Tibet, therefore in Asia, this view of karma is their default mode, They mightn't understand it. I'm not saying they've studied it, but that's their default mode. Whereas for us, being materialists, our default mode, even if we're good Christians or Jews, is still, we're materialists, the mind is the brain, mummy made us, and the outside world is the cause of our suffering. So his view is like shocking. What are you angry? What for, Robina? So then you have to think, well, okay, let's analyse what anger is. What is anger then? Let's analyse, what does anger say? Well, when Neil doesn't do what I want, which is attachment, this frantic craving, deep inside, hard to see it. When he doesn't fulfill attachment's needs, then naturally I'll have a panic attack. How dare he? Why did you not listen to me? I didn't do that. Why do you do that? We get intensely hurt. I mean, we get pain and hurt and freak it out. So what anger says is, what's the philosophy of anger? It's saying, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. It's the voice of ego grasping. It's the deepest voice of this little unhappy me who didn't get what she wanted. And I'm not, don't make that sound mean. Like, I mean, they're these Tibetans. You'd imagine, we would say, they are allowed, we'd say you're allowed to be angry. All this intense suffering, those young women, Jigdrol, You'd think, well, they're allowed, well, our view is you're allowed to be angry. Well, technically, yes, you're allowed to do anything you like. But the Buddhist point is, look at what it causes. So this is a minefield. When you see, if just me not getting what I wanted and Neil doesn't look at me 24 hours a day, then you can think, oh, shut up, Robina, something so ridiculous, grow up. But when it's anger in the face of intense suffering, like poverty and suffering and terrorism and the latest maniacs, you know, ruining the world, then you'd think, well, anger's a healthy attitude. But this is where we need to really do some analysis. I remember Martin Luther King said, he was amazing, you know, he said, it's okay to be angry. He meant it's okay to find fault. You must find fault. Look, there is racism, there is sexism, there is terrorism, there's shocking things in the world. That's not, that's intelligence. That's not called anger. That's ridiculous. That's not anger. That's intelligence. Look at, there is a war, there is a this, there is a that. But what anger is this natural, as we feel, response. How dare that happen? And then the moment we have compassion for one group, we then have anger towards the people who are causing it. This is what we think is utterly natural. Whereas even Martin Luther King's response, he said it's all right to find fault, but then you say, how can I help? What can I do to help? Now that's called compassion. So yes, see the suffering in the world, but the Buddha's view of karma, what do you mean? Angry, it's our own fault. So he has the view, like those young women, that it's happening because of past actions. They accept that. That's their interpretation of the event. This seems to be that Kabbalah rabbi's interpretation of the event. So therefore his response is according. Jigjaw didn't get angry. It's not as if he suppressed anger. He literally didn't have it. Those young women didn't suppress anger. They didn't have it. This is too shocking for our minds. And all I'm doing is getting to this point, reiterating the point, that we have to unpack and unravel and deconstruct all these assumptions in our mind. Because they're coming from, we've all got our viewpoints. So if you have the view, instinctively in your bones, that you didn't ask to get born, that your mother created you, then anger would be a perfect response. When some mean person whom you've never met before comes out of the blue and harms you. Anger is the correct response. How dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. That's literally correct. Well, Buddha says it's not like that. You know? Due to your past actions, you're born in that life, you meet that particular person, due to your harming them, they harm you. Same with happiness. Due to your past virtue, you meet these people who are kind and loving to you. But we don't ask that question. Why are good things happening? We only just can't stand the bad things happening. But they're both for the same reason. Your past actions coming in front of you. It's an intense view. It's an intense view. It doesn't seem natural to us even to think this, you know. Of course, in this room, like I said, I'm talking the big picture point of view. Some people will come here and talk about Buddhism, might never mention the word karma. There's plenty in Buddhism besides this. But this is the big picture point of view, and I like that one. Was that a hand? Ronnie, no? What, Ronnie, you had your hand? No? Okay. Because I mean, just for me personally, when I first heard the Buddhist teachings, you know, I'd been brought up a Catholic, then I was an old radical lefty and all that business, you know. And I bumped into these Buddhists when I was about 31 or something, 32. I really liked the talk about the mind, but what I also just really wanted and really heard was this business of karma. It was something that rang a bell. I hadn't heard of it before, I hadn't thought of it before, but that for me was pretty intense. And for me as a Buddhist these last years has been a massively important part of my approach to being a Buddhist, my approach to life. So, because it means it's owning what happens in your life, it's owning it, rather than this sense of ego, which is to be feeling like a victim of things. And that's very deep. The more we analyse, I think, how we feel, it seems to me, isn't it, we feel that bad things happen for no reason. And this seems pretty reasonable. This is why there's, I think, so much suffering. Why bad things happen. It's a powerful question. Why do bad things happen? Especially if you're a good person. We go crazy with this. It's a really good question. It's a perfect question, and I think it's so fascinating. We all ask the question, why? I've rarely met a person who doesn't say why, you know. I think it's powerful. Well, we've got lots of answers, you know, ways to look at it. Yes, Neil.
For me, instinctively, when I suffer, I want to change my path.
You want to what?
I want to change.
Yes, of course, absolutely, naturally.
If someone calls me sufferer, first instinct for me is to go away.
That's right, I understand. So exactly.
What actually you're saying is this suffering is an attachment. It has nothing to do with my decision to go away.
Yes, it does. It has everything Buddha says. It's the reason in the first place you'd even go away.
The suffering.
Yeah. No, the suffering. In your mind, Buddha would say, there is attachment that always... Attachment's a junkie in us that wants things to be nice. Now, we'd call wanting things to be nice normal, wouldn't we? We just think it's natural, we want things to be nice. Well, Buddha would identify it as attachment, which is a craving, a neediness. And then as soon as it doesn't get the nice thing, then we'll have aversion to something. And as you said, you'll walk away from it. You won't go and punch and kick and shout, right? Because you look like a patient guy. That's how patient people behave. That's good. That's very sensible. But the logic, the analysis of it is that there is neediness and attachment there that always wants the nice things, which means it wants what Neil wants. So, of course, in our culture, we say that's normal, but Buddha's going beneath what we call normal. He says it's, okay, if you didn't have attachment, put it this way, if you didn't have attachment, this neurotic state of mind deep in your bones, and you were blissful and clear, you'd be blissful, you'd be clear, you'd be wise, you'd be fearless. You would recognise the cake that you don't like, but it wouldn't be a problem for your mind. It wouldn't disturb you. You'd recognise crazy behaviour when you see it, and if you could leave it, you would, but it wouldn't disturb you fundamentally in the core of your being. And so if you couldn't, let's say you've one of my friends in prison who can't walk out the door, who can't open that cell, then their minds would be happy. Whereas, you know, normal one is, I mean, I think of people in prison, going crazy is totally common because you're not getting anything that attachment wants in prison. You're treated like an animal. The prisons are garbage. You've got maniacs, cellmates. So unless you know about your mind, people do go crazy, quite literally. So that's a symptom for the Buddha that you've got attachment and aversion there. Whereas if you worked on your mind, you wouldn't have attachment and you wouldn't have aversion, and that's advanced. Therefore, you'd know the guys are crazy, but you wouldn't lose your own sense of clarity. You wouldn't lose your own sense of space or peace, and you would have compassion as well. Now, that's advanced, but that's the consequence. That's how we can become. Are you with me here, Neil? So, not having aversion, not having anger, that's amazing. I mean, I admire people who don't have anger. But also, the aversion arises. Like seeing the ugly thing, you'd see definitely it's not what you want, which is why you'd walk out the door. It's common sense, but also it's your way of handling when attachment doesn't get what it wants. You walk away from it, which is intelligent. But aversion did arise, and maybe a person like you, some patient people, get a tendency to be depressed. Do you experience depression at all? Yeah, that's what happens. The Buddha's view is, if you can try and imagine it like this attachment and aversion are like these very linked states of mind. Attachment's the default mode. It's always wanting the nice things. Every second, every second, every second, every second. The millisecond it doesn't get it, that's the arising of aversion. In someone like me who's very volatile, I would shout and yell. Someone like you, the aversion would arise, but it would go internally. And then one day you can't get out of bed one morning because you're so depressed. Because your aversion is internal, and because everything builds up, even throughout one day, you know, there have to be 100 things that happen that our attachment doesn't like. The red light, the annoying sound, you drop the cup when you did the dishes. Immediately, this, you know, annoyance pops up. Annoyance, irritation, upset, aversion pops up. Well, you'd be sort of more floating along with it, but it goes in. Every time your mind does anything, it stays in the mind. You build it up, build it up, build it up. So internalized aversion manifests as depression. You're inert one day. Are you seeing what I'm saying? It's real subtle. And that's why ever more subtly we have to learn to recognize what's in the mind. So even just dropping something, we're so ridiculous. We curse ourselves, or we get upset, or we feel guilty. And I think it's because we program mummy in our head, and mummy says you shouldn't drop things. So mummy's still in your head, you know. So you get annoyed or guilty when you drop something. So at that second you would deal with it. It's okay, Neil, I can drop another thing, you know. It's all right. It's okay, honey. So you straight away counteract it. And that's a simple example. So if you counteract what arises in your mind every day and sort it out, by the end of the day, there's nothing left over. You haven't left any residual rubbish, you know. Okay, this dealing with it goes to very subtle levels. But even on a fairly gross level in our day-to-day, if we handle the thing when the red light comes, instead of getting all frustrated, relax, Robina, it's just a red light, it's okay. Even a little bit opposing it with an argument in your head, being your own therapist, then your mind's more steady. Your mind becomes less, you're not building up so much junk. You understand what I'm saying? That's how it works at an ever more subtle level, you know. Because this attachment's always there. Always this junky in us that always wants something more, needs something to be how it wants, you know. Are we communicating, people? But so the hard part, like I said, it's not as if attachment comes with a pure state of attachment and then a pure moment of love. They come together. And this is where it's a minefield, you know. In other words, we only really are attached to those we love, and we only love those we're attached to. But they're utterly, utterly different states of mind. Utterly, completely different. If you had a raw moment of attachment, you'd be like a little vampire. You know, if you had a total moment of complete love, you'd be utterly blissful, and it'd be astonishing empathy with the suffering of another. But we have them together. This is why it's a minefield. You can't see one bit from another. And the only time I notice I'm attached is when Neil doesn't do what my attachment wants. So there's this, you know, in the different, all these different techniques that we talk about in Buddhism. So when you discuss in the later stages, in the more advanced stages of practice, which is where you talk about compassion, because the Buddhist idea is you've got to work on yourself first, you know. Compassion is actually more advanced. It sounds like many of us think of spiritual as compassion. It is love and compassion. But you can only really develop genuine love and compassion when it's based on this first stages of practice. That's how they talk about it. So right now, let's say, if we think of the world, there are three categories. There are those people, sentient beings, who do what you want. They're called friends, roughly speaking. There are those who don't do what you want. We call them enemies. Or we might use that word, but it's a good word in this context. And then there's a third category who do neither harm you nor help you, and they're called strangers. Well, there's no fourth category on this planet. There's those sentient beings who fulfill your attachment's needs. There are the sentient beings who don't, and there are sentient beings who do neither. So on the basis of that, how do we feel about these three groups? Well, you adore your friends and you love them and want them to be happy and have compassion for them. That's great. But as long as they do what my attachment wants. I have aversion and upset and hurt and irritation and anger towards those who actually really consciously don't do what my attachment wants, the ones who harm me. And then for the strangers, we couldn't care less. They could all drop dead, you know. It's 99.9% of the universe. So I kind of use this funny analogy, and I can say Neil. So I've never met Neil before. And Panos is his friend. And Panos tells me that Neil gets these terrible migraines. And for me, Neil is a stranger. He's the bloke down the road, okay? Well, I'll go, oh, the poor thing, does he really? But I won't go very much further because he's a stranger. I don't have much empathy for strangers. We sort of do our best. Oh, it reminds me, one time in my iPad, here's my iPad. I carry everywhere my iPad, and I read all my newspapers, right? Because I travel, I don't have any paper, you see. So I read my New York Times. And, you know, down on the corner, I saw the heading in the corner. All the headings in the New York Times are mostly Mr. Trump these days. So it's just unbelievable. Apparently the New York Times and all those good papers in America, they've increased their subscriptions by tenfold since Mr. Trump, you know. The ACLU, you know, that American Organisation for Civil Liberties, they've increased their subscriptions by 400%. And Mr. Trump's doing a lot of good, apparently. Seems like it, since Mr. Trump. Anyway, on the corner, the right-hand corner story, I noticed out of the corner of my eye, it said 350 people die in ferry accident in Tasmania. Well, Tasmania is my people, right? My friends, they're my people, Australians. I went, oh, no. And then I saw that it said Tanzania. And I went, oh, that's okay. I mean, do you understand? Why? Because they're strangers. Then I had to sort of, of course I had to have compassion. I read the story. I tried to imagine where Tanzania was. You get my point? It's very natural. The whole world, we divide them all. The monkeys and the ants and the humans, we all have our friends, our enemies and our strangers, you know. So there's Neil. He's a stranger. So Panos, whose friend he is, tells me about his headaches, and I try to sound compassionate, but it doesn't last long. It doesn't really touch me, does it? Because he's a stranger. Now let's say I meet Neil, and we fall in love, and he moves me in. Do you understand? Suddenly he's now in the friend category, isn't he? Now look how compassionate I am and look how much I love him. And I have compassion. I will stay up all night. I'll spend my money on getting doctors to help his migraines. I will have such compassion for him with his migraines. I'll have such love for him. We understand this is totally normal. We take it for granted. Because now I'm in love with him. Now I'm attached to Neil. I have massive interest. Because of my attachment, I have vested interests now. So the love and compassion are overwhelming, isn't it? We understand this. We don't even question it, do we? Now let's say Neil throws me out, you know, and moves in Ronit. Well, now what category is he in now? Under the enemy. I hope he suffers from his boring old migraines. I mean, speaking simply, we understand this. And our world is divided like this. This is natural. But the Buddha is saying it's because of attachment, you know. So the point is this. In this meditation, later on we'll discuss it, where the aim is to try and recognise that enemies, friends and strangers are equal. They're all completely equal in not wanting to be happy and wanting suffering. They're all not wanting suffering and all want to be happy. It's logical. So think about it, logically. When Neil was my stranger, I bet you asked him, how are your migraines? He would tell you they're unbearable. And then when he's my friend, ask him about his migraines. He will answer in exactly the same way. And when he's my enemy, it's exactly the same. So the friend, enemy, stranger are complete fabrications of our mind that we dump on top of people on this earth. All based on whether or not they fulfill my needs. I mean, we should be embarrassed by that. It's so self-centered. But we think it's normal. We think it's normal. Well, this is what, because attachment. Attachment can, if he does what my attachment wants, I adore him. I love him. Of course I do have love, and of course I have compassion. But as Lama Zopa says, it's unstable. It's based on attachment, which makes it sound that we're really cruel and self-centered. Well, that's Buddha's point. We are. But we just think it's normal. To really analyse these deeper states of mind, you know. So way to go in changing them, but just talking the principle here. So how we literally project our own needs. The normal way we are now, Buddha calls this samsaric, is we are seeing everybody on this planet through the lens of our needs. So if they fulfill my needs, I'm prepared to love them. If they don't, if they actually harm me, then it would sound bizarre to say that you love your enemy. You sound like a wacko person, you know, like she's a bit mental. Because the natural one for us, because they do not fulfill attachment's needs, and they indeed have harmed me. You can say that. Look at the world, the suffering that happens is unbelievable, what people do to each other. So this one of compassion is really outrageous. It's much more advanced, you know. So the way the first point for the Buddha is to learn to recognise how these states of mind harm ourselves. Then we can have some stability in being, you know, in developing, going beyond these lenses of attachment, aversion and ignorance, and seeing people for who they are. Seeing Neil from his point of view. Whether I label him friend, enemy and stranger, he does not feel a fraction of difference. That is my projections onto him. We can see this, it's logical, but it's kind of scary. To have the same empathy for your enemy as you do for your friend sounds almost mental illness for us. Sounds weird, you know. And that comes eventually, though. Buddha's view says it's possible. And the other reason, too, to have compassion, the compassion is like those young women, those young nuns. That's too shocking for our mind. And of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we realised we'd harmed them in the past, and because they will suffer in the future from their own harm. That's intense, you know. So it's like one step at a time, you know. One step at a time. One step at a time. So what role then does so-called meditation have in all this business? Well, there's many techniques, many kinds of meditation, millions of techniques actually. But there's two main modes of meditation. And the one that is the commonest one that people have a vague idea about, known as mindfulness, which is just what it's become known as. But it's actually, like I said, it's this technique it's a psychological skill. It's not religious in its nature at all. It's learning to concentrate, learning to focus. Learning to go against the berserk tendency to have the mind go all over the place, which of course we understand perfectly well, we know that. So it's a skill. So again, like I said, there are various misconceptions about it. You can have your own meditation. Buddha doesn't own the word meditate. It's just that, you know, there's this technique that's come from these Indians that he uses. So from the Buddhist perspective, I'm just talking here, you can decide what you'd like as meditation. People can do what they want. Like I said, Buddha doesn't own this word, but Buddhist meditation, to understand it properly, there's two main modes. And the first one is the one we commonly think of. So, you know, like I said, there's many misconceptions about it. One of them is it's an alternative to a pill, which means we only do it when we get a headache. Well, the analogy is that the only time we think to meditate is if something goes wrong. That's complete misconception. The Buddhist approach is we ought to all learn it from the time we get tiny, you know. It's a skill to help us focus the mind so you can step out of your head, so you can begin to observe the contents of your own mind and distinguish between the neuroses and the goodness. Speaking really simply, that's the practical application of this technique in day-to-day life. So the first thing is to learn to focus. And even, you know, 3 minutes a day of this. Often what happens is people sit down and do mindfulness meditation for 20 or 30 minutes. And if you don't know what you're doing, then most of the time is just ignorance. Most of the time you're just spacing out. So the point is, this technique, as I'm saying, is a really rigorous skill to enable you to focus the mind, which implies not follow every thought. It is not an alternative to a pill. It is not a relaxation technique. This is a really important point. You know, if you're driving on the freeway at 120 kilometers an hour, you need intense focus. There's absolutely no question. You need intense focus. You can't afford to lose the plot for 1 millisecond. You'll be dead. That's the level of focus you're trying to cultivate. It sounds like hysterical saying it like that. Because why? Because the tendency of the mind to wander all over the place is profound. So it's really intense to learn to focus the mind. So relaxation technique, we need them. We're really berserk. We need relaxation techniques. There's no question. And so there's lots of them. Yoga has got wonderful relaxation techniques. We need them badly, but this is not that. So important to know this. It's to focus the mind, which simply means attempting not to follow every thought. And we know the thoughts are there continuously. That's why when we start to do this technique, you think your mind is getting worse. You think you got more thoughts. No, you haven't. You're just noticing them. And that's excellent. Don't think you had a bad meditation. You had a good meditation. Because if the job is to become familiar with your own mind, then another misconception about meditation is to make all the thoughts go away. That's like making the pain go away. But that's not helpful. As you advance in this technique and you've gone to more subtle levels of focus, you will indeed be beyond conceptuality and the sensory. But that's super advanced. You might get moments of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean you had a good meditation. The goal of this technique is to focus. Why? So you can stop following blindly every feeling and thought without any awareness. So you're stepping out of your head, if you like, for 2 or 3 minutes. And that's incredible. So you're learning to, and then eventually you're learning to you're paying attention to, the thing you'll concentrate on, you'll anchor your mind to the breath. You might just choose to use as the object of your meditation, the breath. It can be anything, but the breath is a really simple example. The sensation coming out of your nose, you know? We'll do it a little bit later. You're focusing on something. You've got to anchor your mind to something. So naturally, so what's going to happen? Okay, the two main obstacles, And when they describe this technique in the text, and this is going back to the Indians, then it's described in terms of 9 stages of cultivation of this concentration. And the most advanced level is kind of beyond the beyond for us. If you were to see a person who had accomplished this single-pointedness, they would look like they were dead. They've literally gone beyond the conceptual and the sensory, which is why we think it's cosmic, you know, but it's not. Because we're talking, remember here, subtler levels of our mind that we never access. So the 2 main obstacles to getting any focus at all is the 2 tendencies of the mind to either be over chatty and never stopping, overexcited, the thoughts going, which is, you know, what we know happens, or the other tendency to space out, for the mind to be dull. So it's either the mind to be overexcited or the mind to be dull. Now some people can sit and be very peaceful in their mind for 5, 10, 20 minutes, you know. But you could argue that they're just spacing out. And that is not the purpose. That's just feeling good, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's called relaxation. But that's not the purpose here. So you've got to have this real clarity about what you're trying to achieve, which is a state of super focus, that isn't all berserk, and focus that is calm without the mind spacing out. And it's almost impossible initially. But that's what you've got to understand what you're trying to accomplish, you know. And starting with even 3 minutes is really excellent. It's fantastic. So I'd say, you know, the long-term goal of this technique is to access these subtler levels. And to do that sincerely, you've got to give up sex, drugs and rock and roll and go to the mountains for a couple of years, you know. You've got to be already pretty highly advanced to get this focus. You've got to have given up any interest in food, sex, stuff, mortgages, girlfriends, children, jobs, all the rest. You've got to be pretty advanced already to sincerely go to the mountains, or go, you know, metaphorically speaking even, to really get this focus. You've got to be intensely involved. Some of my friends are spending their lives doing these meditations, so that you can get the focus, so you can do the real job of unpacking and unraveling the contents of your mind. That's the purpose of it. So the main obstacles are the mind to be berserk, excited, which is this typical model. As soon, you know, when you're wide awake and wound up, your mind's berserk, isn't it? But there's a kind of a clarity there, which makes us get things done, you know. That's a good quality. We've got to stop the mind never stopping, and never stops, never stops. And this is utterly, utterly, utterly natural for us. There's no concept in any of our materialist models of the mind that would suggest there are techniques coming directly from Western psychology to help you focus your mind. There might be some, but the level to which they say we can do it is quite astonishing. And then the other extreme is the mind spacing out, becoming dull, which is a very pleasant feeling, but it's like ignorance. It's not clarity at all. So what I'm getting at is this. That's the long term, is to get concentration. But I'd say for most of us, the immediate benefit of watching your breath for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, whatever, you know, be humble about it. The real benefit is that because you're training your mind. You know, it's like, it's like you're in a room with 100 people and you're really excited to hear everything those people are saying. So you're like a little bird going around. He says this, she says that, and this is an analogy for our thoughts, okay? Our head is full of 100,000 voices. And we normally just kind of go along on autopilot, doing the dishes, doing this, driving the car, and we're just chatting away, chatting away, chatting away. 99% not conscious. We know that. It's only when something intense has happened that the conversation goes berserk, isn't it? The pain, the hurt, the happiness, whatever. But most of the time, we're absolutely unconscious. Absolutely unconscious. And we call that natural. Okay, so for 3 minutes, you're making this strong determination, like you're in the room of 100 people and you're going to watch that spot on the wall and you refuse to get distracted. So that means you've got to just pay attention to that spot. It's just an analogy, okay? And you're not going to get distracted. That's what you're aiming to do. I'm not going to get distracted by anything else. No matter how delicious things are, no matter how ugly things are, I will just say focus on that spot on the wall. It's like that, except the spot on the wall is your own breath with your eyes closed, you know. It sounds so easy. Technically, it is easy, but to accomplish it even reasonably for 2 minutes is intensely difficult because of our absolute addiction to launch, to dive into the thoughts. We're driven by those thoughts so intensely, you know, so strongly. We just wander off, have all these conversations. Addiction, we're addicted to that. That's attachment energy. It always wants to find something nice to think about, you know. So to focus, to intensively focus just on that breath, and then have another part of your mind, every time you wander off, you bring it back to the breath. You bring it back to the breath. You bring it back to the breath. That's the technique. It's not wholly in its nature. Do not have any expectation of suddenly thoughts going, or having a vision, or feeling good. This is like ridiculous. It's not the point. It's not the point. It's not the point. The point is to get some focus. So then it could get moments of when it's really focused. You could get moments when suddenly your thoughts will kind of stop. You have a very nice feeling. You could. They're like bonuses. They're not the goal. They're not the goal. The goal is to focus your mind. So the benefit of this in your daily life is that because you're training yourself to not follow every thought blindly, then you become more conscious in the background of all the thousands of thoughts. Don't think that's bad. That's good. That's the goal. Because now you can begin to hear all the crazy thoughts, which you didn't think you had before. One of the commonest feelings is as you start to meditate, you think you're getting worse. But you're not. Even in the Indian text, they talk about in the traditional presentations of this technique in terms of 9 stages of cultivation. Pabonka Rinpoche says that, you know, one of the signs of success at the first of the 9 stages of this cultivation of concentration, you think you're getting more conceptual. You think there are more thoughts. No, it's because you're just noticing, and that's excellent. Because in daily life, that's what we need to be doing effectively. The reason to have concentration is so you can work on your mind and see what's happening. And that goes ever more deep, ever more deep, ever more deep. Because these voices inside us, these thoughts are so tightly packed. And the ego voices are so tricky. You know, so hard to distinguish the ego voices from the virtuous thoughts, you know. I call them voices, it just means thoughts. Are we communicating here? Any questions? Any questions? Oh, is that a sigh? No questions? Any more questions? Yes, sweetheart, go.
Is it really possible to have relationships without attachment?
I understand, yeah. Darling, it's, of course, according to Buddha's view, of course it is. That's the whole point. But way to go. Way to go. It sounds shocking, doesn't it? Way to go. Yes, of course it is. Way to go, though. And that's mostly our daily practice. That's what daily practice is, you know. Daily practice is seeing our mind and learning to maneuver this minefield, trying to recognize love, compassion, virtue, forgiveness, clarity, generosity, and to distinguish it from the other stuff. But it's really, really subtle and really, really deep and really, really hard. But that is the whole point. That is the job. That's the daily application of this stuff. Yeah, exactly. I mean, to go to the point where Buddha says we can, which is utterly to give up attachment, you know, you practically achieve nirvana by then, so don't hold your breath. In other words, if we can understand this fundamental process, it's gradual, 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 then yes, that is the job. That is the job. But it's very hard, because I mean, it's not a joke. You know, it's like I always quote this number, the UNESCO or somebody did, there's a number quoted around the world, that 40% of all women who get murdered on this earth, it's the guy in the bed who murders. This is not against men. This is showing the depth of attachment and anger and fears and jealousy. Because things go wrong not with your strangers down the road. I mean, we can still punch up the stranger, but the trouble is when it's too close. You know, which is showing us the intensity of what goes on in our mind. And if we never pay attention to it and just blame everybody else, this is the chaos that ensues, you know. But that's the theory of it, yeah. And that's what the day-to-day job is of a person who's attempting to use this stuff to recognise when it's your attachment, when it's your anger, when it's your... You understand? Of course it is. But that, you see, I think if we just take the normal view of ordinary human beings, it's not being mean about human beings, we're all, we're all human beings. Like Lama Zopa said, if we really can see this, which sounds quite shocking, that just ordinary people, there's no recognition that if you have two people having an ordinary relationship with no awareness of what, no awareness of anything, what goes on in their mind playing any role at all, that's when the chaos happens. The blaming, the anger, the resentment, the vomiting out, the shouting, shouting about your hubby to your sister, to your mother, to the boss, all just constant turmoil. That's just normal life, really, extreme, even mildly suffering, that's ordinary life. And if we never question that, and never think that what goes on in my mind actually might play a role in this, that seems like a revelation almost. But that's just normal human life. So when a person's in a lousy relationship, whether it's with your boss or your partner or your sister, look how we talk. It's always about what they did wrong. And you're always this innocent victim of it. And do you understand? So to begin to have an idea, to know your own mind for your own sanity's sake, is pretty intense thought already. It's pretty amazing. I mean, even the fact that we're sitting here now, even having this discussion, I'm not trying to be arrogant about it, is pretty incredible. Do you understand my point? That we can learn to know the contents of our own mind, and for our sake and the sake of others, we can learn to change it. It's pretty advanced. But the trouble, but it's so hard. So, like I'll use a typical example. Okay, one of the ways they talk about ego is it's sort of like, it's like victim. You're a victim. And I'm not trying to be so mean. It sounds intense talking about it like this. But let's just say, as an example, for example, one of my friends in Australia, this is years ago. She's a grandmother now, but she's got an alcoholic husband. This is where attachment and compassion and all this stuff becomes a minefield when the dramas do start. So naturally, because he's an alcoholic, it has been for 30 years, right? 40 years. Then naturally when he first became an alcoholic, you'd want him to change. So in one sense, when you're talking about attachment, because her attachment wasn't get what it wanted, she'd be angry with him and resentful, and then probably get him to change and go to AA, and then he'd fall off the wagon. Then she'd talk about him to her sister, and she'd talk about him to and she'd complain about him. I mean, this seems typical life, right? Typical. So what happens is in ordinary relationships, you blame the alcoholic husband for your suffering. Naturally, we would all do this, wouldn't we? And it seems reasonable. No one's going to complain. But when you're not realising you've got some choices, and this is part of the irony of ego is we don't feel we have a choice. When you feel like it's not my fault, he's an alcoholic husband, he's causing my suffering. But we never get to the point where we even begin to think, well, you know what, I could make a decision here. If I can't handle it, maybe I should leave. But when you're a victim, you never think that. It's almost like when we're a victim, which is ego, which is the tragedy, we run back like moths to a flame, continuing to blame, continuing to criticise, continuing to get upset, to blame the external circumstances. So it mightn't even be in a relationship. It could be about our relationship to money, our relationship to anything. We always are finding ego desperately wants to find the way to get off the hook, to not be responsible, to not be accountable. But it's not my fault. It's the way the world is. I'm living in a poor country. I can't help this. Therefore, we're always finding a way to get off the hook. It's very deep inside us. So my friend, the point is, she happens to be a Buddhist. At some point, she realised he wasn't going to change. So she realised she had a choice. And if we could get to this point, no one would ever harm anybody, because we'd realise, even what Neil's saying, he meets a thing that's horrible, he walks away from it. But when we're caught up in relationships and all these overwhelming, the world thinks we shouldn't break up and you're not supposed to be divorced and people will criticise me, we have this drama going on inside us, and then you keep blaming the husband. What she did at some point, she said she realised she had to make a choice. Go or stay. So this is my point. She decided, she weighed up the benefits. She said he's a quiet drunk, and I've met the man, he's a nice guy. He's humble, he's generous, he's kind, he doesn't vomit on anybody in any way, he just drinks himself to oblivion every night. But he's generous and kind and loving. So she weighed it up and decided it's best that she stayed. For the kids, the grandkids, him and herself. So once she'd chosen, she'd become accountable. She realised she couldn't change this situation, but there's no point in bashing her head against a brick wall. So when she chose that, that's when peace comes. When you know you can't change it, but you can change your mind. This sounds so simple. We get this point. It's very profound. My friends in prison, they don't have a choice. They can't open those doors. They can't change anything. But they work. This is why I'm so admiring all the people I've known for the last 20 years who are working with Buddhism in prison. This is what our project did. They realise their backs are against the wall. They can't expect the judge to be kind, the door to open one day. So then you stop being a victim. You realise you're in charge of your life. And you can't change the prison, but you change your mind. That's what my friend did. That's real, that's like self-respect. But the trouble is when we're caught up in the attachment and the anger and the hurt, we really believe we don't have a single choice. We believe we are the victim of circumstances, and that's the tragedy of ego, you know. That's how we all are. So it's intense, really. When we can take responsibility, as Buddha says, if you can change something, please change it. But if you can't, that's like when the hard work starts. Do you understand what I'm saying here? And this is what's so painful, so difficult. Because ego wants other things to change. It's not my fault. He should change. They should change. I'm right. They're wrong. Ego gets so indignant and hurt, and it's heartbreaking because it causes all our suffering, you know. It's easy to fall into the victim trap and blaming external circumstances of any kind, which means I'm off the hook. Ego wants to get off the hook because it can't take responsibility, you know. It's intense, actually. It's hard work. It's intensely hard work. But it's for our benefit. It's not moralistic, it's not religious, it's not belief, it's intensely hard work. And that means every day is practice. So, you know, like she, with her life, now she's chosen, it's been many years now, to live there. When you really see her, she's genuinely happy. Hubby every night takes out his 5 bottles of beer, sits with the dog because he likes nature, drinks his 5 or 6 bottles of beer, comes in, has dinner at 7 o'clock, he's very disciplined, and then drinks his 5 bottles of wine, you know. I mean, literally. And she never complains, she loves him, she cooks his dinner, they have talk about the weather, talk about the things. There's no longer suffering for her. Her heart breaks for him, he's harming himself, but he doesn't harm anybody else, so, you know, it's very powerful, actually. That's an extreme example. When you hear some, I mean, anyway. And the conclusion, she's content. She's made her, you know, she's made her choices. We can see the suffering in our mind. It's not fair. If only the boss is so mean, he's unkind. Then you say, would you like to leave the job? No, I can't because I need the money. I can't do this. I can't. So we can't have it both ways. But ego wants. So we want to blame the world because it's not fair because I can't get any job. It's not fair because there's no jobs around. I can't leave work because I mightn't get another job. So we've got to decide that's possible. In which case you have to decide to try and change your mind. Okay, we're not so, I mean, even those young Tibetan nuns were able to forgive their torturers. That's extreme examples. But we seem to not be able to change our mind about the boss, but keep going back to work like a moth to a flame and keep blaming the boss and then being tortured by this lousy job. We often live in our whole lives in relationships like that. I mean, there's no one saying this is easy, but this is what practice is. This is what the meaning of real practice. You make your choice, you know, you choose. It's so hard though. Because we want to keep blaming, and we want to keep saying it's not our fault. And yet we can't make the choice to leave the relationship. So, of course, what's the conclusion is complete insanity. Don't be surprised you killed your boss, you killed your husband one day, you know. You understand? Isn't it? But it's scary, because then all the pressures, you know, we talk about attachment to things. But the deepest attachment, we really only start to see this as we practice, you know. The deepest attachment we have is to what people think of us. This is the most powerful. And it's so instinctive, every second. We've been learning this since we're little babies, you know. This attachment is desperate to be seen in a good light. We want to be seen in a good light. So this often completely paralyzes us throughout our life, and we're too scared to make any decisions. Oh, people mightn't like it. Or I don't know. We say, I don't want to upset people. Or I couldn't leave my husband because, you know, I don't want to hurt him. I couldn't leave the job because my mother doesn't think, you know, shouldn't. I couldn't do this because, you know, no one approves of it. It's so deep inside us that we don't actually have enough courage to make really heavy decisions, difficult decisions, because we're so scared of what people think of us, what the world expects, what mummy expects, what they expect, what he expects, what people think. It's always this constant dualistic idea of we're being watched by other people and judged by others, and we can't stand the thought to be not liked, not seen in a good light. It's very deep inside us. They even say the greatest meditators up in the mountains who've given up everything but are still thinking about how the people in the village are thinking about them. You understand? This is the deepest one. This is the closest one to ego grasping. This constant sense of the way we're seen by others, you know. Like loneliness. What do you think loneliness is? You've got no one to share your thoughts with. This is normal and human, but analyze it. In other words, when you're on your own and you're talking your own thoughts to yourself, you feel like they're not valid because no one else is hearing them. That really shows the depth of our suffering, you know. We want someone to... Suddenly, when someone else hears my thoughts, then I feel I must be a valid person. Well, what is it about your thoughts that are so horrible that if you have them on your own, they're not worthy? It's very weird. If they are, then why share them with somebody else anyway? But this is how deep attachment is. The need, and it seems so normal. I think our psychological models in the world, this is the basis. I think we consider that we are social beings in our nature, and we learn to develop as a human in reference to others. So that's why in Buddhist, that's why from the materialist point of view of a mind and what a person is and what creates us and what makes us, a person living in the mountains on their own, there's no, I think that would be the most extreme, you know, autistic, we would think in our materialist world. You can't imagine what a person's doing in the mountains on their own, meditating. That sounds just weird in our ordinary culture that assumes we are in our nature social beings that grow in response to feedback from others. So good feedback, yes. A mummy needs to give good feedback to her daughter, loving her and praising her. But what we don't distinguish in Western psychology, I would suggest, is this deep craving in us, this deep neediness, the neurotic need to be approved of, which, you know, is causing intense suffering. Yeah.
What is it when you come down from a mountain?
Yeah.
Then it becomes very difficult with the others. Not what they say about you, but you feel that they disturb your mind.
Oh, sorry, no, you have to start again. I'm lost.
I live in a mountain. Not alone. I'm alone with my animals, let's say, but I have no neighbor. I live in a mountain, and I stay. The last 6 months, I almost see nobody. And it was the most beautiful time of my life, I would say. And just following teachings and so on. But okay, now it's a bit better, but I find it very hard to come down.
To be with others? Yes. To then be with other people?
Yeah.
Okay, so then...
And, like they became more thoughts. I have my own thoughts.
Yes.
Which are
That's right.
And this one, they came on the top of this.
You mean everybody else's chaos as well?
Yes.
Well, you know, it's a question of
how can you manage that?
I understand. Okay. I mean, I don't know what you're doing in the mountains, and whether I'm not going to. I mean, are you talking about practicing in the mountains or just living your life? What do you? I mean, you mean seriously meditating every day or what?
Both. I have to make my own life.
Yeah.
But meditating also and following teachings.
The teachings. Okay. Okay. Then maybe it's a question of degree, because if we keep progressing, it moves into compassion. So you using the mountains metaphorically, if you're really seriously doing single point of concentration or working on your own mind, then at certain stages, you're right, it can be very shocking to go around to the rest of the world again. But as you progress, then it grow in the mountains even, it would grow into compassion for others because you realize the whole world is the same. So the more you know your own mind, the more you understand why you're feeling this way, the more you work on your own mind, when you do meet others and connect with others, it would not drag you down. That was when empathy, when compassion would come. So maybe it's just a question of how much stability we grow. You need to just more stability in the mind and more clarity about yourself, you could say. Because that's where, it's as if you're an alcoholic and you've given up alcohol. So you come back to the world again and you meet all the alcoholics, but you still haven't got enough stability in your mind, it still freaks you out. So then you've got more work to do, in other words. Do you understand? Yeah. Putting it that way. And then eventually when you go back to the alcoholics, you so understand what's going on, you now even have compassion for them and it doesn't disturb you anymore. So we've got to know what our own reality is, our own level. Some people have to live on their own. Some people can't cope with living in the big city. Some people we've got to know what we can handle. We've got to know where we're at and what we can handle. Some people completely can't cope with being around all the crazy traffic and all the buildings and all the noises and everything. Each person's different. So you have to know what we can handle for our own sake. Do you understand? But yeah, that's very reasonable. Nothing wrong with that. But don't turn it into aversion for others. That's important. That just becomes anger and paranoia. That's a disaster. Do you understand? Okay, good. I think it's tea break again. Suddenly it's a tea break. It is, it's a tea break. Okay. Go and have tea break. All right. Yeah. So why don't we just talk a little bit more about what this concentration meditation, and we'll just do a 5-minute session of it. So basically, the body doesn't meditate, but the body obviously, is there, and it needs to be in a conducive position. It's been found, by the great meditators over the centuries. There are various points about the body that are helpful. So the first one is your legs. All the Asians, certainly all the Indians, and then since then the Tibetans and all the others, have found that having the legs in what they call full lotus position, which is cross-legged with your one instep, each instep on the other thigh. There's something about this that's really practical, okay, especially for advanced practitioners. There's something about the alignment of these more subtle energies, which we might discuss later, to all be in alignment. And because the body is very tightly kind of packed in with each instep on the other thigh, your body's very stable. So you can sit upright, meditating like that for hours, in fact days, some people. You don't topple over, And so that's the first point. If you can do that, the Dalai Lama says it's really auspicious to start your session in this full lotus position. It kind of creates the cause to be able to do it in the future, If you can't, that's fine. Have one leg on the other thigh. If you can't do that, have ordinary cross-legged. If you can't do that, sit in a chair, whatever, That's the first thing. But in terms of how you sit, if you want to sit on the floor, then it's important to find the way the cushion works for you. Some people like a big cushion. So, if you were able to sit full lotus position, then you just need a little cushion propping you up underneath your coccyx, It helps you sort of thrust forward slightly, not topple backwards. But you've got to find the position that works for you. That's the first thing. And the bottom is the second thing. So then the second one, they talk about the back. It's really important that you hold up your own back. So if you're sitting in a chair, now make sure your feet are firmly planted on the ground and you're not slumping into the back of the chair. Hold up your own body. It's important that you hold up your body, which is how your body would be if you're cross-legged, because then they talk about it, the more subtle energies, the subtle nervous system we have. We might mention this later. Then all the energies are kind of working very nicely. So they say to think of your spine like an arrow, ramrod straight, and the coccyx is like the head of the arrow pointing into the earth. So the legs in the way they are, then the arrow, the back straight, and the body upright. So the next one they say is they talk about the shoulders should be very straight and upright, not slumped and not tense. So in general with the body, I like to say it like this, that you think of your skeleton. If your skeleton was hanging on a hanger, it would be absolutely straight, wouldn't it? All the bones upright. But then think of all the soft part, your flesh, the muscles, the fat, all hanging on that skeleton. Well, they should be relaxed. So the body should be upright, but the soft parts relax. So relax, consciously relax your muscles. Have your body upright, your shoulders square, your back straight, and then flop your muscles, especially your abdomen. We hold a lot of tension there. So really relax your muscles, flop all the muscles, but don't slump your body. Keep your body upright. So the body should be upright and the muscles relaxed. That's a perfect combination. So relax your abdomen, relax your shoulders, but the bones upright. The next one is your hands. There's different positions all the meditators use, and this is a traditional one we're taught. Your left hand underneath, right on top, the two thumbs forming a triangle. Your hands resting in your lap, but not close to you, not tense, close to your body, relaxed. Now the main part is your head. Several points there. So have your head slightly tilted forward, your chin tucked in. If you have your head thrust backwards, it kind of makes the mind agitated. So your head slightly tilted forward, chin tucked in. And then your jaw completely relaxed and your lips slightly apart. And the tip of the tongue, this seems odd but there's logic to it, the tip of your tongue resting just behind your top teeth near the palate. And all the meditators over the centuries have found that if your tongue is in this position, you don't dribble, you don't have to swallow your spit all the time. It's all practical. Because some people meditate, are doing this meditation seriously for a long time. So your tongue resting behind the top teeth, just near the palate. Jaw relaxed, lips apart. And then finally your eyes. Well, actually all the meditators over the centuries have found, I suppose if you're doing meditation all day and you're meditating in the daytime, then it's really good to have the light coming in. So they would have their eyes open. But that implies you've got good concentration. Well, we get so distracted by that, I think, because our mind has not gone very inward. It's still involved in all the sensory objects. So if you can have your eyes open, that's fine. But if not, have your eyes looking down. Have your eyes lightly closed. But have your eyes looking down, as if you're looking along your nose towards the ground. That's the ideal position, okay? So check just the legs, the bottom, the back, your hands, your jaw, your lips, tip of the tongue, behind the top teeth, your eyes looking down, and your eyes lightly closed. Settle into this position. So we can see, can't we, especially this afternoon, the tendency is to go straight to sleep. Just nod off, and that's our deep tendency. That might be an interesting point just to observe here. We're going to do like 3 minutes of quality meditation. So we can see the tendency, which is to slump and space out. The moment you subdue your senses, that's what happens naturally. So another time, if your mind's busy, then the other option, the other extreme is your mind go berserk. So they're the two main dangers. And the beginning stages of this concentration meditation is you're really learning to be alert to counteract each of those tendencies. So the job at hand, the actual job, is simply to pay attention to the sensation at your nostrils as your breath goes in and out. So for like 1 minute or half a minute, just take a couple of breaths, and the job is to locate that sensation, the sensation at your nostrils. It's slightly different when you breathe in and out. You'll see it's slightly different, but that's the focal point. So just locate that focal point. Take a couple of deep, complete breaths. Not loud, not forced. Breathe all the way in, all the way out, keeping your abdomen relaxed, and just locate that sensation. So now with, okay, a little bit more I'll say, and then we'll do it. So, you know, there's actually various parts of your mind involved in this action. So they're all thoughts. So the main part is the one where we say pay attention. So there's one part of the mind, they call it attention. You're going to simply pay attention. Then there's other parts of your mind. We don't think like this, but imagine there's another part. I mean, the Dalai Lama calls it like the policeman. It's called vigilance. It's another part of your mind that is going to be watching attention like a hawk. You know, imagining attention is the part watching the breath. Well, vigilance is the part that's watching, and every time the attention wanders off, this vigilance part, you imagine it like this, you know, brings your attention back to the breath. I think of it a bit like as if you're a kid walking on the edge of a cliff. That's attention, is the kid. Then vigilance is like the mother, is watching like a hawk. If the kid's staying on track and is not wandering off, then vigilance doesn't interfere. But if attention wanders off and going to fall over the cliff, then vigilance sticks their nose in and brings it back to the breath. This sounds a bit odd initially, but don't just space out and think, I'm watching my breath. It's much more specific than that. So with strong determination, okay, for 3 minutes, you're going to pay attention to your breath, almost think like as if your life depended on it. You're not going to space out, you're going to have strong determination. That's why not to think of it as a relaxation technique, because you just space out. And we don't want to space out, and we don't want the mind to go berserk. So you've got to keep it on track, simply watching the breath. In and out. That's the job to be done. And the moment vigilance notices wandering off, notice you spacing out, notices you following off other thoughts, you simply bring it back to the breath. You bring your attention back to the breath. That's the actual job you're going to do, with strong determination and a wish not to miss one breath. Just simply watch your breath. Just bring your mind back to the breath, just the breath. Keep the mind sharp, alert, just on the breath. Just the breath. Okay, relax now. It really is better to have 3 quality minutes than even 7 minutes when most of the time it's spacing out. Because when we understand the goal, you really get the point. If you think it's relaxation, which is the typical view, then you're completely on the wrong track. It's very pleasant, but it's not the point. Can you hear this point very clearly? I presume you can. Do you have any questions about it? Do you have any questions about it?
Does it matter if I'm concentrating on my breath or on the sounds outside?
Well, because you're trying to bring the mind internal, concentrating on the outside just keeps your mind on the outside. It can help. You can do that easily. You can take anything to focus on. You can, of course you can. But at the end, the long-term goal of this is to go internal. So even then, even from that perspective, the breath is still external. It's got to be something subtler. So to help, it helps it to be internal because you want to go more internal. But in the end, it can be anything. You can concentrate on your shoes. Do you understand my point? So the aim is to keep the mind sharp and focused. That's the whole point, though. That's the point. So you can just as easily do it on a sound. You could, of course, for that reason. But it's to train the mind to stay focused. You understand? Any other points? Yeah.
So,
Neil.
I can hear my thoughts.
Of course you can, yeah.
I can hear them.
That's right.
I can feel the body.
Yeah, of course.
I can feel things moving.
That's right.
I can feel the dog.
That's right.
So the main thing is to be focused.
Just deciding to choose one thing to focus on. And in case this is naturally they're all there because our mind is conscious of all these things. But the job is to help to choose one thing to focus on, just to keep your mind to be sharp. That's all.
Okay.
Do you understand? That's the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. But see, one of the things is, if you can hear all your thoughts, that's in a sense good. You're not going to pay. It's like you're in that room of 100 different people all chatting. You can't help but hear them, but you're not focusing on them, and you're not going to engage in a conversation with them. And that's good that you're seeing them because they're your thoughts. That's why we often think our mind's getting worse. But it's excellent, and then so that the training in this is in your daily life. Instead of just being absorbed in the traffic, knowing there are thoughts going on but you're not noticing them, when you start to be more focused, you can't help but also notice your thoughts, and then you can process them when they happen. Because you're training yourself to be familiar. But your goal in this meditation is not to focus on them, but you can't help but hear them, and that's excellent. Don't think it's wrong.
No, but what do I need to focus on?
But as I said, but the breath, I just said, the breath. That's the job.
Yeah.
That's the decision you make. That's the decision you're going to make. You decide what you're going to focus on. You're just anchoring your mind to some one thing, that's all. Typically, the breath is a good example. There are other meditation, they call it Mahamudra, where you're training your mind to watch the thoughts. That's more tricky. You've got to know what you're doing, but that's also, we can try that one out as well. You're just training your mind to take something to focus on, to anchor your mind to it. So then what you're developing from that is clarity, the ideal. It doesn't mean you get it straight away. Do you understand? Because the tendency is to follow whatever's there, isn't it? Mindlessly, most of the time. Yeah. Any other questions?
What happens to me is that whenever I try to observe the breath, I change it. I'm trying to, I try to have a natural breath.
Yes.
And all of a sudden I try either to make it longer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you have to try and stop doing all that. You have to stop being conceptual about it, just watching it, let it take itself.
Yeah.
You've got to stop. I mean, that's okay, you do what you like, but in the end, the goal is not to do that. The goal is to allow the breath just to be natural and just simply pay attention to it. Yeah. Do you understand?
It's just changing. It's changing the heartbeat. It's changing. I try to focus, and then the mind is going, and then I try to bring.
Yeah, well, you're not paying attention to the breath. Then you're paying attention to everything else. You just pay attention means you try to ignore all those trips of the mind. You just. Yeah. In this particular meditation, the goal is to focus on one thing. That's it. That's the goal. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Mm. We can do other little kinds. There's nice other kinds. We'll do other kinds, tomorrow and the other day. Yeah. Anybody? Any other questions? Can you hear how like I said to Neil just before, how there can be an advantage? You mightn't get much focus, but because you're stepping out of your head, you're aiming not to follow the thoughts. You can't help but notice the thoughts, isn't it? Yeah. So this is why very commonly people say, "Oh, my mind's getting worse." Because if you've never paid attention to your thoughts in your whole life, which is not uncommon, then it's quite a shock because you start to hear all these crazy thoughts. You think, "Oh my God, I'm going crazy," but we're not. It's just that they've always been there, a million thoughts a minute. We just literally don't pay attention until they're shouting loud. Then we have mental breakdowns, It's kind of interesting. What else, people? Any questions before we finish then? It's time to go home.
So it's not real that our thoughts shout more when we try to take them over?
Start again.
I feel when I try not to listen to my thoughts,
yes,
they shout more.
Yeah, well, I understand.
To call my attention.
No, I understand. I don't think that they're shouting more. I think it's just that you're noticing them more because your mind's quiet, I think. But the aim is, it's like the same with the sounds outside. Suddenly dogs can start barking. And this is where we can really see in daily life how scattered our minds are. Neil pointed right at the beginning. Suddenly if there was a huge bunch of noise out there and cars revving their engines, we'd kind of get upset. Because our mind would as soon as the noise, our mind runs to that noise, and then we judge it if it's nice or not nice, and then we get upset or we get happy, one or the other. That's what our mind's doing all day. That's what distracted mind is. You're on the freeway, and because there's so much traffic, you can't handle it. And then a person here shouts, and that person says something over there. Our mind tends to run to whatever is the main thing. That's why we literally have no focus whatsoever. It's very typical for us if suddenly the cars were revving their engine, we go, "Oh no." We would not be able to stay even focused on our breath. But that's the aim, is to simply ignore the dogs, ignore the sound, ignore. That's why when you're on the freeway and there's so much traffic and then suddenly the car comes behind you, you have a panic attack and you freak out and you can't focus on anything because we're not used to keeping our mind focused. We're used to being easily distracted. We're so easily distracted, and that's why we get exhausted. Not because the sound is loud. It's because we're not used to not following whatever goes on. We're like little birds that will follow anything. That's why we're exhausted by the end of the day. It's almost like our mind has got no strength, Our mind runs to whatever's there. That's what we call distraction, and that's why we're so scattered. And why we can't go deep in our mind. The aim is to start going deep into your mind. Well, we can't until we've got some focus. It's kind of obvious, We just stay on the surface. And then we're caught up in attachment and the thing we want to think of. Then we have aversion, then all the dramas. I mean, this is where you can see in ordinary daily life how even the smallest thing happens. You're nearly going crazy with all these conversations, and we can't stop them, you know. And we just assume it's normal to not stop them. But this is Buddha's deal. We've got potential for incredible control over our minds, you know. So it really is like, it literally is like training. It's training, you know. Training to do anything. Yeah.
I have a question about what you said before. When you were talking about attachment and the mind getting very angry about things that seemingly affect us.
You like distractions and noises and the traffic and all this. Yes, yes.
Whatever.
Yes.
How about when the mind gets angry about the things that do not affect us directly, seemingly do not affect us directly? To see something that we judge as wrong.
Yes, and we get it.
It doesn't affect us, maybe at all. But
you mean like reading about the news and people harming each other and terrible injustices happening?
About somebody hurting an animal? Or
No, of course. No, darling. No, we'll go on. We'll talk about that tomorrow. This is where we have to. This is where, you know, you can say that's called compassion. You see some suffering, but then what tends to happen immediately, because of our particular view, we think the suffering is caused by that horrible guy. So our compassion immediately turns into anger. Then we do all the blah blah blah. So we'll go into that more tomorrow. Because this is just inevitably what happens, especially with these days, with just news flooding through every sense, every moment. The world can be absolutely overwhelming, isn't it? So this is where we have to learn to distinguish between attachment and aversion and virtue, compassion, and that again is a minefield. We'll go into it tomorrow. Yeah. So I think we stop. So you people, what are you going to do now? Going to have dinner, hang out, go to parties, get drunk? What are you going to do now?
All of that together.
All of that together, okay.
We're going to weed, I'm going to eat.
We're going to eat? Okay, good. Well, good people. So listen, so tomorrow, so then we, okay, so good. So we finished with a little kind of another prayer, like I think of them as two bookends, you know. We began the day with a little motivation, so we finished with what we call a dedication. So thinking, and this is the Buddha's view, as many moments as there have been, as many thoughts we've had since we started this morning, is as many seeds we've planted. Maybe we don't remember 99% of it, it's true. You know, we couldn't repeat verbatim, including me, I couldn't, what we've been talking about, but it's all gone in. So we think maybe nourish these seeds with our efforts from this moment, you know, even practicing tonight, noticing your mind, observing things, being aware of what your thoughts are doing, you know, why not make them part of your homework? So we think of all these seeds we've planted, maybe nourish them from this moment forward with our efforts so we can develop our amazing potential, so we can be of benefit to others, no matter how long it takes. Thinking like this. I'll do a little prayer, we call it dedication. What I'm going to sing effectively says that. And there's a second little prayer, which is just making the aspiration that compassion grow and grow in the hearts of all. Kewajin yududag lama sangye drugyurne drowa chikyang malupa dei sala gopashok Changchob semchog rinpoche ma kye panam ke gyuchig ke panyampa me payang gong ne gong du baba shok. Okay, so there's three bits of homework. Between now and when you go to sleep, try to. There's two parts to it. If you think this is the compassion approach, that your body and your speech is for others. Think like this, that that your body and your speech. So you think whoever sees me, whoever hears me, whoever talks to me, may they benefit just from my presence. And then your mind, that's your business. So pay attention to your thoughts, notice, observe. There's negative, there's neurotic, there's jealous, there's attached, there's ridiculous, there's kind, there's love, there's empathy. Just observe and kind of like noting, you know, it's really helpful. That's really, really helpful. Just to note the different thoughts. And then make your body and speech useful to others. That's one part of your homework until you go to bed. And then when you go to bed, when you hit the pillow, make a strong decision that if you can, to be aware that you're dreaming while you're dreaming. There's reason to that. We'll talk about it tomorrow. So to be noticing that, you know, some people can be aware that they're dreaming when you're dreaming. That's really kind of interesting. So that's the second piece. And the third piece of homework is, you're supposed to laugh now, if you wake up in the morning. There you go, see? But we all assume we will, because one of the big mistakes in our mind is we all think we're permanent, because we can't stand the thought of dying. So if we wake up in the morning, you know, we think, as soon as you come back to consciousness, you think, wow, amazing. My petrol tank of morality hasn't run out yet. I'm still alive, right? And I'm going to make the most of today. Hop out of bed, come to class. Does anybody want to do a meditation in the morning earlier? If you feel like it, if you're around, maybe not. If you'd like. Even a couple of you. We'll check if we can use the room. Where's Ronit? We can use the room? Okay, well, what time's breakfast? Do you have your breakfast here or do you have your breakfast at your house?
House.
Okay. What time do you like to have your breakfast? Those who want to. I'm not saying anyone has to come, but if you want, because oh, I've got to get here, don't I?
Okay.
We can do that? Well, maybe we'll say, like, just for half an hour. 7:30 till 8 or something. Is that too early? Oh, 8 o'clock. Oh, sorry. So,
It's a bit early.
okay, we'll do it after breakfast and come a half an hour early. Come at 9 o'clock. Better. 9 o'clock after your breakfast. But you've got to do your little practices. Watch your body, speech and mind before you go to bed. Hit the pillow and think, may I see my dreams as dreams. Wake up and think, wow, how amazing, still alive, I must make the most of today. And then see your breakfast differently, like the work of heart of all the sentient beings. And then 9 o'clock, come for a little meditation, and we'll do a couple of techniques. And then 9:30 teaching. If you'd like to come early, you're very welcome. If we can use the room, can we, Ronit?
This room, I think.
Yes.
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 Okay. If you'd like it, those who want, no pressure. All right? Thank you, darlings.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Panayoti.
Something funny.
What, tell me?
I usually aware when I'm dreaming.
Good.
But I used to have very strange dreams
Yes,
that I'm in all kinds of sidewalks looking for something all the time, and I was walking all the time, but I was aware, and the dream was